Remove him from that seat now. The words cut through the first-class cabin like a blade, sharp enough to silence the low hum of pre-flight chatter and the clink of champagne glasses, sharp enough to turn every head in a matter of seconds, and in the center of it all sat Darius Cole, unmoved, unbothered, as if the command hadn't been aimed directly at him, as if the tension thickening the air around seat 2A belonged to someone else entirely. The overhead lights reflected softly against the polished surfaces, the kind of quiet luxury designed to make people feel important, but in that moment it exposed something else, who was considered important and who wasn't, and standing just a few feet away, a flight attendant with a tight smile and colder eyes pointed directly at Darius again, her voice lower this time but no less firm. "Sir, you need to give up this seat, it's reserved for priority passengers." And there it was, the assumption wrapped in policy, the judgment dressed as procedure, the kind of sentence Darius had heard more times than anyone in that cabin could imagine. And still, he didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't even sigh. He simply looked up at her with a calm that felt almost out of place, like still water in the middle of a storm. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here." Now back to Darius Cole. He had boarded 10 minutes earlier without a single issue, scanned in, clean ticket confirmed, no entourage, no designer labels, just a black t-shirt, dark jeans, and a quiet presence that didn't demand attention but somehow held it anyway. And that was the problem, because to them, he didn't look like someone who belonged in first class, didn't look like someone who could afford seat 2A, didn't look like someone who could possibly be the kind of man the system was designed to serve. And across the aisle, a well-dressed white passenger shifted impatiently, glancing between the attendant and Darius as if the delay itself was an inconvenience he shouldn't have to endure, as if the solution was obvious and only waiting to be enforced. "We have a guest who needs this seat," the attendant added, her tone tightening, and behind her, another crew member nodded in agreement, arms crossed, already convinced, already aligned, already certain of how this story was supposed to go. And still Darius didn't move, his hand resting lightly on the armrest, his posture relaxed, almost deliberate, like he was waiting, like he was watching something unfold exactly as expected. A few rows back, a younger flight attendant hesitated, glancing at a handheld device, then back at Darius, uncertainty flickering across her face before she stepped forward slightly. "I think his ticket scanned." But she didn't finish, cut off by a sharper voice from the lead attendant. "That won't be necessary." And just like that, the truth was dismissed, replaced by authority, replaced by confidence loud enough to override doubt. And the cabin shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough, whispers beginning, phones subtly lifted, eyes narrowing as people started to sense that something wasn't right, that this wasn't just about a seat, this was about something deeper, something older, something that had played out in rooms like this long before today. Darius finally spoke, his voice even controlled. "My ticket says 2A. He said, holding it out without urgency, without challenge, just fact. But facts in moments like these were rarely enough, and the attendant barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "There must be a mistake," she replied, already turning slightly as if the conversation was over, as if his presence itself was the error that needed correcting. And that was when the air changed, not because of anything loud or sudden, but because of what didn't happen. Darius didn't argue, didn't defend, didn't escalate. He simply leaned back into the seat, eyes steady, expression unreadable, like a man who had seen this exact scene before, like someone who knew exactly how it ended, even if no one else in that cabin did. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the quiet tension and the forced smiles and the shifting discomfort, something else was already in motion, something unseen, something that would turn this moment from a simple request into something none of them were prepared for. But for now, all they saw was a man being asked to move. And all they believed was that he would. The silence stretched just a second too long, the kind that makes people shift in their seats and glance at each other without saying a word. And in that quiet, Darius Cole remained exactly where he was, his gaze steady, his breathing even, as if the pressure building around him had no weight at all, while the lead flight attendant exhaled sharply, clearly not used to being ignored, clearly not used to someone refusing to comply without raising their voice. "Sir, I am not asking again," she said, her tone sharpening into something less polite, more performative, something meant to show control rather than maintain it. And a few rows behind, someone whispered under their breath, not loud enough to interrupt but loud enough to carry. "He already showed his ticket. And that was when the second layer began, not loud, not explosive but deliberate, the kind of escalation that hides behind procedure. The attendant turning to her colleague. "Check the manifest again," she said, already expecting confirmation of her assumption, already confident in the outcome, while the younger attendant hesitated. Again scrolling through the device in her hand, her brow tightening as she looked back at Darius, then back at the screen. "It still shows seat 2A under his name," she said quietly, and for a moment, just a moment, doubt entered the space like a crack in glass, thin but visible, and it should have ended there. It should have been corrected, acknowledged, resolved, but instead the lead attendant shook her head with a dismissive smile. "Then the system is wrong," she replied, as if the easier answer was to erase him than to question the process, and just like that, the narrative shifted from verification to justification, from truth to control. Across the aisle, the waiting passenger adjusted his jacket, glancing at his watch, impatience replacing curiosity. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with expectation, and the attendant responded quickly. "We are resolving it, sir," her posture straightening, her tone softening just enough to signal priority, and that contrast did not go unnoticed, not by the passengers watching, not by the phones now subtly angled to capture the moment, and certainly not by Darius, who simply leaned forward slightly, placing the torn edge of his boarding pass flat against the tray table, smoothing it out with the same care someone might use for something far more fragile. And when he spoke again, it was quieter than before, but somehow carried further. "So the system is wrong when it shows me," he said, his eyes lifting to meet hers, "but right when it does not." And there was no accusation in his tone, no anger, just clarity, the kind that makes people uncomfortable because it leaves no room to hide. The attendant's smile tightened, her patience thinning. "Sir, you are delaying departure," she replied, shifting the focus, reframing the issue, turning the inconvenience into his responsibility. And behind her, another crew member reached for the tablet, tapping quickly, almost too quickly, the screen reflecting in her eyes as she navigated through menus that most passengers would never see. And then with a small nod she said, "There is no record of that seat assignment anymore." And that was the moment the room changed again, because now it was not confusion, it was alteration, it was not a mistake, it was a decision. And the younger attendant looked up sharply, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was there a second ago." "But no." One responded to her, not directly, because acknowledging that would mean admitting something far more serious than a seating issue. It would mean admitting intent. Darius watched it all without interrupting, without reacting, as if each step confirmed something he already knew. His expression unchanged, but his stillness now felt heavier, more deliberate, like a man allowing a story to write itself before turning the page. And from the back of the cabin, a passenger stood slightly, leaning into the aisle. "This is not right," she said, her voice steady enough to be heard, and another voice followed. "Just let him keep the seat." Simple solutions from people who had nothing to prove, nothing to protect, but the crew did not move, did not yield, because by now it was no longer about the seat, it was about being right, about maintaining control in front of an audience that was no longer silent. The lead attendant stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough to make it feel personal. "You are going to have to move," she said, and Darius looked at her for a long second, not defiant, not pleading, just present, and then he leaned back again, folding his hands loosely in his lap and said, "Then I suggest you take the next step." And something in the way he said it, calm but certain, made the words hang in the air longer than they should have, because it did not sound like resistance, it sounded like permission. And somewhere behind the controlled smiles and the shifting discomfort, the situation was no longer unfolding randomly, it was moving exactly where he intended it to go. The moment he said it, the balance in the cabin shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that made the air feel heavier, like something unseen had just entered the room, and the lead attendant hesitated for half a second, just enough for anyone paying attention to notice, just enough to reveal that she was no longer entirely certain of how this would end, but certainty was not something she was willing to lose in front of a full cabin. Not now, not after pushing this far, so. She straightened her posture, glanced briefly toward the front of the plane, and made a decision that would take this from uncomfortable to irreversible. "Fine," she said, her voice regaining its edge. "We will escalate this." And with that, she turned and signaled toward the galley, where a uniformed supervisor had been quietly observing, waiting for the situation to either resolve itself or demand intervention. And now it had demanded it. The supervisor stepped forward with measured authority. His presence calm but firm, the kind of presence designed to restore order, not question it, and as he approached, the low murmur of the cabin softened into near silence, because everyone understood what came next. This was the step where things usually ended, where the passenger complied, where the system reaffirmed itself, where the story returned to normal, but Darius did not move, did not adjust, did not even look surprised. He simply watched the man approach as if he had been expecting him. All along, as if this was not escalation but confirmation. "Sir," the supervisor began, his tone neutral, practiced, "I am going to need you to step out of this seat so we can resolve this properly." And there it was again, the language of control wrapped in politeness, the assumption that movement would equal cooperation, that standing up would equal submission, and for a moment no one spoke, no one interrupted, the entire cabin waiting for the simplest outcome. But Darius tilted his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the request, and said, "Resolve what?" His voice steady, not challenging, just precise, and the supervisor paused just briefly, because that question did not fit the script. It did not follow the expected pattern. It required clarity instead of authority, and clarity was harder to manufacture in a room full of witnesses. Behind them, the younger attendant shifted her weight, her grip tightening on the device in her hand, her eyes moving between the supervisor and Darius, as if she wanted to speak again but did not yet know how, while a passenger across the aisle leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching closely, no longer pretending this was none of his business, and another passenger raised a phone a little higher, no longer subtle, no longer hiding, because by now it was clear this was not routine. This was something people would talk about later, something they would replay. "There appears to be a discrepancy with your seat assignment," the supervisor continued, choosing his words carefully, and Darius nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging the effort. "There was," he replied, "until it was changed." And the supervisor's expression tightened slightly because that sentence carried weight. It implied sequence, it implied intent, it implied that what had happened was not accidental. And the lead attendant quickly stepped in, her voice sharper now. "There is no record of him in this seat," she said, reinforcing the new version of reality, and the supervisor glanced at her, then back at Darius, caught between two narratives, one backed by staff, the other by calm certainty, and in that moment the easiest path was still the same: remove the passenger, restore order, move forward. "Sir, I am going to ask you one more time," he said, his tone firmer now, less neutral. "Please stand up." And the words hung there, heavier than before, because this was the line, the moment where compliance or resistance would define everything that followed. And still, Darius did not move. He simply looked at the man in front of him, his expression unchanged, his voice quiet but unmistakable. "You are about to make a decision that cannot be undone." And there was no threat in it, no raised volume, just certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself. And for a second, just a second, the supervisor hesitated, because something in that tone did not match the situation. Something about the way Darius carried himself did not align with the story being told. But hesitation in a uniform is dangerous. It invites doubt, it weakens authority. And the cabin was watching, waiting, measuring every second, every word, every glance, and so the supervisor took a breath, preparing to act, preparing to follow through, preparing to close this situation the way it had been closed 100 times before, unaware that this time, the moment he crossed that line, the entire narrative would collapse around him, because what he saw as resolution, Darius had already set in motion as something else entirely. The supervisor's hand hovered for just a moment at his side, not touching, not forcing, but close enough to signal what came next, and in that small space between action and restraint, something else broke through. "Wait," a voice said, clear, steady, and impossible to ignore, and every head turned not toward the front but slightly back, where the younger flight attendant stood now fully in the aisle, no longer half hidden behind procedure, no longer silent, her hands tight around the device, as if it carried more than just information. "I checked it twice," she said, her voice stronger this time. "His ticket was valid, it scanned green, seat 2A, no flags." And the words landed differently because they were not emotional, not dramatic, just factual, and for the first time the narrative in the cabin split openly, no longer one voice versus silence, but one voice versus another, truth pressing against authority. The lead attendant's expression hardened instantly, her eyes narrowing. As she stepped closer, lowering her voice in a way that made it sharper, not softer, "Emily, step back," she said. The name carried like a warning, not a request, but Emily did not move, her shoulders squared just enough to show that she understood what she was risking. and still chose to stand there. We cannot just erase him from the system and pretend it makes sense, she added. And that sentence did not just challenge the situation, it exposed it. It pulled the quiet manipulation into the open where everyone could see it, and a ripple moved through the cabin, not loud but undeniable, the kind of shift that happens when people realize they are watching something real, something wrong. The supervisor glanced at the lead attendant, then back at Emily, and for a second his authority wavered, not gone but tested, because now there was a witness, and witnesses change everything. They make decisions heavier, they make outcomes harder to control, and from somewhere behind a passenger spoke up. She said it was valid. His voice calm but firm, and another followed. Then why are you making him move? And just like that, the room was no longer passive, it was participating, not loudly, not aggressively, but enough to shift the weight of the moment. The lead attendant exhaled sharply, her patience thinning into something closer to frustration. This is not up for debate, she said, raising her voice just enough to reclaim control. We are following protocol. And that word hung there again, protocol, the shield that turned decisions into rules, that made bias sound like structure. But Emily shook her head slightly, almost instinctively. Protocol does not delete names, she said, and the simplicity of it cut deeper than anything louder could have. Because it was undeniable, because it was clear. Darius watched all of it without interruption, his gaze moving briefly toward Emily, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them, not gratitude exactly but recognition, the kind that said you see it too, and then his eyes returned to the supervisor, who now stood at the center of something far more complicated than a seating issue, something that had grown beyond control without ever raising its volume, and the supervisor cleared his throat, adjusting his stance, trying to recenter the situation. We will verify this again, he said, but even that sounded different now, less like a decision and more like a reaction, less like authority and more like correction, and the lead attendant stepped in quickly. There is nothing to verify, she insisted, but the certainty in her voice no longer carried the same weight, not after what had been said, not after what had been seen. A phone chimed softly from somewhere in the cabin, a notification breaking through the tension, and another followed, and another, small sounds that signaled something spreading beyond the plane, beyond this moment, something being recorded, shared, witnessed in real time, and the lead attendant noticed it too, her eyes flicking toward the raised screens, toward the subtle but growing evidence that this was no longer contained, that this was no longer just internal, and for the first time a hint of something else crossed her face, not doubt exactly, but awareness, the realization that whatever happened next would not disappear quietly. Darius leaned back again, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, as if the entire situation had slowed down to match his pace, and when he spoke it was not to argue, not to defend, but to clarify. You had a chance to correct this, he said, his voice calm, measured, and instead you chose to build on it. And there was no anger in it, just observation, just fact, and that made it heavier, made it harder to dismiss, and the supervisor looked at him, really looked this time, not at his clothes, not at his seat, but at the way he carried himself, the way he spoke, the way he did not react like someone losing something, but like someone waiting for something to finish. And that was the moment the doubt became real, not loud, not obvious, but enough to change the way he stood, enough to shift the way he breathed, because somewhere beneath the procedure, beneath the pressure, beneath the watching eyes and the rising tension, a question had finally formed, quiet but impossible to ignore. What if they had chosen the wrong person to move? The question lingered in the air longer than any command had, heavier than any instruction, and for the first time since this began, the supervisor did not immediately respond, his eyes shifting between Darius, Emily, and the lead attendant, as if trying to reconcile two versions of the same moment that no longer aligned, and in that pause something deeper surfaced, not just tension but memory, because for Darius, this was not new. It was familiar in a way that settled into his bones long before this flight ever boarded. Years earlier, in a different terminal, under colder fluorescent lights and with a cheaper ticket in his hand, he had stood in a line just like this, younger, less certain, still learning how the world measured him before it ever listened to him, and he remembered the agent who had looked at his identification, then back at his face, then at the screen and said, "This does not match," not because it did not, but because it did not fit what she expected, and he remembered the way people behind him had sighed, the way time had stretched, the way he had been asked to step aside while others moved forward, and that moment had not ended with a confrontation, it had ended with quiet compliance, with a delayed boarding pass and a lesson he never forgot, that sometimes the system did not need to shout to make its decision clear. Now, standing in a different cabin in a different life, that same pattern unfolded again, just dressed in better lighting and softer language, and Darius blinked once slowly, grounding himself not in the memory, but in the present, because this time the outcome would not be the same. Sir, the supervisor said finally, his voice more measured now, less certain. We are trying to resolve this professionally, and Darius nodded slightly, acknowledging the attempt. Then start with what is true, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer landed harder than any argument, because it removed the layers, stripped away the framing, and left only the facts, and facts in that moment were not on their side. The lead attendant stepped forward again, her voice tighter, faster, trying to regain the pace she had lost. He is refusing to comply with crew instructions, she said, directing the narrative back to behavior, back to control, but Emily spoke again, her voice no longer hesitant, no longer searching for permission. He is not refusing anything, she said. He is asking you to acknowledge what you changed, and the word changed echoed differently than deleted, because it implied action, it implied choice, it implied responsibility, and a few passengers shifted again, leaning closer, no longer just watching but processing, connecting the sequence of events in real time. A man across the aisle shook his head slightly, speaking to no one in particular. This does not feel right. And another voice followed, quieter but firm. It is not. And the cabin, once passive, had become a space of quiet alignment, not loud enough to disrupt, but strong enough to influence, and the supervisor felt it. The weight of those watching, the pressure of being the one who would decide how this ended, and he looked again at Darius, really looked this time at the stillness, at the control, at the absence of panic or defensiveness, and something about it did not match the role they had placed him in, did not match the story they were trying to tell. What exactly are you asking for? The supervisor said, and this time it was not a command, it was a question, real and unguarded, and Darius answered without hesitation. Nothing more than what was already given, he said, his voice steady. A seat that was assigned, verified, and then taken. And the clarity of it cut through everything else, because it was simple, because it was undeniable, because it did not need embellishment, and for a moment no one spoke, not the crew, not the passengers, not even the lead attendant, whose confidence had begun to crack under the weight of what could no longer be ignored. Somewhere near the back, a phone notification sounded again, louder this time, followed by another and another, as if the outside world had started to catch up with what was happening inside this cabin, as if the moment had already begun to move beyond their control, and the lead attendant noticed it, her eyes flicking again toward the screens, toward the realization that this was no longer contained, that whatever happened next would not stay here. And that awareness shifted something in her posture, not enough to admit fault, but enough to recognize risk. Darius leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the tray table, his voice dropping just enough to feel personal, direct. You had every opportunity to stop this, he said. And each time you chose to go further. And there was no accusation in it, just sequence, just cause and effect, and that made it heavier, because it meant the outcome was no longer accidental. It was earned. And the supervisor exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision settling onto him in a way it had not before, because now it was not just about removing a passenger, it was about justifying everything that had led to this point, and that was something far harder to do under the eyes of a cabin that was no longer willing to look away. And in that moment the balance shifted again, not fully, not yet, but enough to signal that whatever happened next would not follow the path they had expected. Because the man they had asked to move was no longer the only one holding his ground. The cabin did not erupt, it did not explode into chaos, it tightened like a room holding its breath, like a moment stretched thin enough to snap. And right at the center of it, Darius Cole reached into his pocket. With a calm that felt almost surgical, slow, precise, intentional, not the movement of a man reacting, but the movement of someone initiating, and when he pulled out his phone it was not rushed, not defensive, it was deliberate, like turning a key that had been waiting for this exact moment. And the supervisor noticed, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion but in awareness, because something about this did not follow the pattern anymore. This was no longer a passenger trying to hold onto a seat, this was something else, something quieter and far more controlled. Darius unlocked the screen, his thumb moving once, then again, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, and entirely unshaken. Rachel, he said, not loudly, not for the room, but the room heard it anyway, because everything was quiet enough now for even the smallest word to carry. And on the other end, a voice responded immediately, sharp, professional, already prepared. I am here, she said, and that Response alone shifted something invisible in the cabin, because it did not sound like a casual call, it sounded like continuity, like this moment had already been anticipated. The lead attendant crossed her arms, forcing a small laugh that did not reach her eyes. "Sir, calling someone is not going to change the situation," she said, trying to shrink the moment back into something manageable, but Darius did not look at her. He kept his gaze forward, his tone unchanged. "It already has," he replied, and the simplicity of that sentence landed heavier than anything louder could have, because it implied that the outcome was not ahead of them, it was already in motion. "Proceed," he added, and there was no urgency in it, no panic, just instruction, clean and controlled, and on the other end, Rachel's voice responded without hesitation. "Understood, initiating review now, board members are being notified, live feed request is in progress." And that was the moment the language in the room changed, not louder, not faster, but different, because those were not words people used casually, not in a situation like this, not over something as simple as a seat. The supervisor's posture shifted slightly, his shoulders tightening as he processed what he had just heard, because escalation usually moved upward within the crew, not outward beyond it, and certainly not to something that sounded like a board. And for the first time he did not speak immediately because the situation had stepped outside of his training, outside of his script. The lead attendant tried to recover, her voice sharper now, more defensive than authoritative. "This is unnecessary," she said, but the word unnecessary no longer held weight, not after everything that had unfolded, not after the witnesses, not after the contradictions, not after the phones quietly recording every second. And Darius finally turned his head. Slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence. "It became necessary the moment you changed the record," he said, and the word changed landed again, heavier this time because now it was no longer a claim, it was being documented, formalized, elevated. Behind them, Emily stood still, her eyes fixed on Darius now, not in confusion but in realization, because she understood what was happening before most of the cabin did. She understood that this was no longer about proving a mistake, it was about exposing a pattern, and that distinction changed everything. Another notification sound echoed through the cabin, then another, then a soft vibration from somewhere closer, as if multiple devices were receiving the same wave of attention at once, and the lead attendant noticed it, her confidence cracking just enough to reveal something else underneath, something closer to concern, because whatever this was, it was no longer contained within the aircraft, it was moving outward, gaining visibility, gaining consequence. "Rachel," Darius continued, his tone steady, "log the timeline from boarding to now, include all verbal directives and system changes," and there was no hesitation on the other end. "Already in progress," she replied. "Audio and passenger recordings are being cross-referenced." And that sentence shifted the room again, because now the witnesses were no longer just observers, they were part of the record, part of the evidence, part of something that would exist beyond this flight. The supervisor exhaled slowly, his authority no longer a shield but a responsibility, and he looked at Darius with a different kind of focus now, not as a problem to resolve, but as a factor to understand, because the man in front of him was no longer reacting to the situation, he was controlling its outcome. And that realization came too late to undo what had already been set in motion. Darius leaned back once more, placing his phone calmly on the tray table in front of him, his hands resting lightly on either side, as if the hardest part was already done, as if everything from this point forward was simply the result of choices that had already been made. And when he spoke again, it was softer than before, but it carried further because the entire cabin was listening now. "You should have checked," he said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a conclusion, and the weight of that sentence settled over the room like something final. Because deep down, even before the reveal, even before the confirmation, everyone could feel it, the shift was no longer coming, it had already begun. The shift was no longer subtle now, it was tangible, like a pressure drop in the cabin that everyone could feel but no one could quite explain. And the supervisor's radio crackled softly at his side, a voice breaking through with just enough urgency to cut through the silence. "Captain requests status update immediately." And that alone would have been routine on any other flight, but not here, not now. Not with everything already unraveling in front of a full cabin of witnesses. And the supervisor reached for it instinctively, pressing the button, his voice lower than before, controlled but no longer confident. "We are handling a seating discrepancy," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded smaller than the situation had become. Darius did not move, did not react, he simply let the moment continue, let the system catch up to what had already been set in motion. And then his phone lit up again, not with a ring, but with a connection, a shift from call to presence, and Rachel's voice returned, sharper now, more formal. "Darius, the board is online," she said, and that sentence did not just land, it settled, it spread, it reached every corner of the cabin because of what it implied, because of what it confirmed, and the supervisor's hand froze on the radio for a fraction of a second, his eyes moving back to Darius with a new kind of focus, no longer questioning what was happening, but realizing that something far beyond his authority had just entered the room. "Patch them through," Darius said, his tone unchanged, and within seconds, a second voice joined, older, measured, unmistakably executive. "This is Chairman Wallace." The voice said, clear even through the small speaker, "We are reviewing a live incident involving passenger Darius Cole." And that was the moment the illusion collapsed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because the name no longer existed in uncertainty, it existed in confirmation, and the title that followed it carried weight that could not be dismissed, could not be reframed, could not be overridden. The lead attendant blinked once, then again, her composure slipping just enough to reveal the realization setting in, because she understood before anyone else what that name meant, what that voice meant, what that connection meant, and the supervisor lowered his radio slowly, not because he had been told to, but because it no longer mattered, not in the way it had a minute ago. Darius finally lifted his gaze fully, not just toward the supervisor, not just toward the attendant, but toward the entire cabin, his voice calm, steady, and impossibly clear. "You removed me," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle, for the room to hold them, for the silence to amplify them. "From a seat on an aircraft operated by a company I hold controlling interest in." And there it was, not shouted, not forced, but undeniable, a sentence that did not just explain the situation, it redefined it entirely, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, because the reality had shifted too fast, too completely, and the room needed time to catch up. The chairman's voice returned, sharper now. "We have confirmed the booking under Mr. Cole's account," he said. "And we are reviewing the system changes made within the last 15 minutes. And that sentence carried consequence, not just implication, because it meant the actions taken were no longer isolated. They were recorded, traceable, accountable, and the lead attendant's posture changed instantly, her shoulders tightening, her hands no longer steady, because the narrative she had controlled moments ago was now being examined from above, from a level she could not influence. Emily took a small step back, not out of fear, but out of understanding, because she knew this was the moment, the turning point, the line between assumption and reality finally being crossed, and around her, passengers who had been recording, watching, whispering, now sat in stunned silence, their phones still raised but their expressions changed, because what they were witnessing was no longer just unfair, it was historic, it was the exact moment where power revealed itself without raising its voice. The supervisor cleared his throat, but no words came out at first, because there were no words in his training for this, no script for when the passenger in question was the one who ultimately held authority over the entire operation, and when he finally spoke it was quieter, stripped of the certainty he had started with. "Sir?" he said, but even that felt insufficient now. Because the title no longer fit, the role had changed, the dynamic had shifted, and Darius did not interrupt him, did not correct him, he simply held his gaze, letting the silence do what it always did best, reveal everything that had been hidden underneath. The chairman's voice cut in once more, final, decisive. "All involved personnel are to remain in place pending immediate review," he said, and that was it. Not a threat, not a warning, but a directive that carried weight far beyond the cabin, and as the words settled, the entire space felt different, not tense, not chaotic, but rebalanced, as if something invisible had been corrected, as if the room itself had been forced to recognize what it had failed to see. And at the center of it all, Darius Cole remained exactly as he had been from the start, calm, composed, and unmoved, because for him, this was never about the seat. It was about the moment they chose to decide who belonged before they ever chose to check. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, thick with realization, with consequence, with the unmistakable weight of something irreversible. And for a few seconds no one moved, not the supervisor, not the lead attendant, not even the passengers who had been recording every moment, because the scene had shifted from confrontation to exposure, and exposure had a way of freezing people in place, forcing them to confront what they had just participated in, what they had allowed, what they had overlooked. The supervisor was the first to react, but not in the way he had before, not with authority, not with instruction. Instead he straightened slightly, his posture no longer defensive but formal, almost cautious, as if every movement now carried risk. "Mr. Cole," he said, and even the name sounded different this time, heavier, acknowledged. "We were not aware." And the sentence trailed off incomplete because the explanation no longer mattered, not after the confirmation, not after the board had entered the conversation, and Darius did not interrupt, did not correct him. He simply watched, letting the weight of the moment settle without interference. The lead attendant, however, could not stay still, her composure unraveling in small visible ways, her hands tightening at her sides, her eyes flicking between Darius and the supervisor as if searching for something to hold on to, something to regain control. "This was a misunderstanding," she said quickly, the words rushed, no longer measured. "We were following procedure." And that word came back again, procedure, but now it sounded different, thinner, like a defense that no longer had structure behind it, and the chairman's voice returned immediately, cutting through the cabin with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. "Procedure does not include altering verified records," he said, each word deliberate, precise, and final, and that was the moment the last layer of protection disappeared, because what had been framed as confusion was now defined as action, and action carried accountability. A soft chime echoed again from multiple phones, and this time no one tried to hide it, no one lowered their devices, because the room had crossed a line where silence no longer served anyone. And across the aisle, the passenger who had been waiting for the seat leaned back slowly, his earlier impatience replaced by something quieter, something more aware, because even he understood now that this had never been about preference, it had been about assumption, and that assumption had consequences. Emily stood still, her breathing steady, her eyes no longer uncertain, because what she had spoken earlier had now been confirmed, validated, elevated, and in that validation, she no longer needed to defend it. The truth had moved beyond her voice. The supervisor nodded once slowly as if accepting something larger than the moment itself. "Understood," he said into the radio, his tone formal, controlled. "All involved crew will remain in place." And even that sounded different now, not like an order being given but like one being followed, and the shift in hierarchy was no longer subtle, it was complete. Darius remained seated, exactly where he had been from the beginning, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and when he spoke, again it was not louder, not sharper, just clearer. "You did not need to know who I was," he said, his gaze moving briefly across the crew, then the passengers, then back to the supervisor. "You only needed to do what was right before you decided what I looked like." And the sentence landed with a quiet force that no raised voice could match, because it reached beyond the situation, beyond the seat, beyond the moment. It addressed the pattern itself, the instinct that had driven every decision made in the last 15 minutes. The lead attendant lowered her gaze slightly, not fully, not completely, but enough to reveal that the certainty she had started with was gone, replaced by something else, something closer to realization. And realization did not come with noise, it came with stillness, with the kind of silence that forced reflection. The chairman's voice returned one final time, calm, decisive, effective immediately. "All actions taken during this incident are under formal review. Access privileges are being evaluated in real time." And that sentence did not just end the situation, it sealed it, because it meant the consequences were no longer theoretical, they were active, unfolding, unavoidable, and the cabin felt it, not as tension but as resolution, as the quiet settling of something that had finally been corrected. A few passengers lowered their phones slowly, not because they lost interest, but because the moment had shifted from something to capture to something to absorb, something to remember, and near the back, someone exhaled softly, almost a release, almost relief, because what had been wrong was no longer being ignored. Darius reached forward calmly, picking up his phone, glancing at the screen for a brief second before placing it back down, as if confirming what he already knew, that everything was now in motion beyond this cabin, beyond this flight, beyond this moment, and when he leaned back again, it was with the same composure he had carried from the start, the same stillness, the same control, because in the end nothing about him had changed, only the room had finally caught up to who he had been all along. The cabin did not return to normal, not immediately, because moments like this did not reset, they redefined, and even as the overhead lights remained the same and the low hum of the aircraft systems continued beneath everything, the energy had shifted into something quieter, something heavier, something that lingered in the way people sat, in the way they looked at each other, in the way no one rushed to fill the silence anymore. The supervisor stepped back slightly, no longer positioned as an enforcer, but as someone who understood that his role in this moment had changed, his voice softer now, measured in a way that carried respect instead of control. "Mr. Cole, we will ensure this is handled appropriately," he said, and this time, the words did not feel like a script, they felt like acknowledgement, like the beginning of accountability rather than the continuation of authority, and Darius gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as approval, but as recognition that the shift had finally occurred. The lead attendant remained still for a second longer than necessary, her earlier confidence replaced by something far less certain, her gaze lowered just enough to avoid direct contact, not out of fear, but out of the quiet realization that the moment had passed her, that the decision she had made could not be undone, only answered for, and around her, the other crew members adjusted subtly, their posture no longer aligned with hers, but with the new reality that had taken shape, one where assumption no longer dictated action. Across the aisle, the passenger who had once waited for the seat now leaned back fully, his earlier entitlement gone, replaced by a silence that spoke louder than any apology, because even without words the understanding was there, that what had seemed like a small inconvenience had revealed something much larger, something systemic, something that could not be ignored once it had been seen. Emily moved quietly back toward her position, but there was nothing small about her presence anymore, nothing uncertain, because in a moment where silence would have been easier, she had chosen to speak, and that choice had mattered, not just for Darius but for everyone watching, for everyone who had ever recognized something wrong and wondered if it was worth saying out loud. The chairman's voice did not return, it did not need to, because the decision had already been set in motion, and the consequences were no longer waiting, they were unfolding quietly, efficiently, beyond the walls of the aircraft, in systems and processes that would continue long after this flight reached its destination, and Darius understood that. He understood that this moment was not the end of anything, but the correction of something that should have never been allowed to continue. He reached forward once more, adjusting the edge of his boarding pass on the tray table, smoothing it out as he had before, a small, almost symbolic gesture, as if restoring order to something that had been unnecessarily disrupted, and when he leaned back again, it was with the same calm that had carried him through every second of this, the same composure that had never needed to rise in volume to be heard. The plane remained at the gate a few minutes longer than scheduled, but no one complained now, no one checked their watch with impatience because time in that moment had taken on a different meaning. It was no longer about departure, it was about what had just happened, what had just been witnessed, what had just been corrected in real time. A quiet murmur moved through the cabin, not disruptive, not chaotic, but reflective, as if people were processing the weight of it, connecting it to their own experiences, their own memories, their own moments where something felt off but went unchallenged, and now they had seen what it looked like when someone did not raise their voice, but refused to lower their standard. Darius looked forward, his expression unchanged, not satisfied, not triumphant, just steady, because this had never been about proving who he was. It had been about revealing how quickly people decided who he was not, and as the final preparations for departure resumed, as the cabin slowly settled into its routine once again, he spoke one last time, not loudly, not for attention, but clearly enough for those closest to hear, and through them, for the message to carry further than the moment itself. "I did not need you to recognize me," he said, his voice calm, grounded. "I needed you to treat me like I belonged before you knew why. And that was it, no more, no less, a statement that did not demand agreement, did not require applause, but left something behind, something that would stay with everyone who heard it, long after the plane left the ground, long after the moment itself had passed, because dignity, once revealed, had a way of making everything else impossible to ignore.